So, as you guys may or may not know, Kyrie Irving has been in the news recently and has stirred a lot of controversy. For those of you who may not know, Kyrie Irving is the current combo guard, shooting guard for the Brooklyn Nets, multi-time All-Star. Won a championship with the Cleveland Cavaliers in 2016, where he hit, as Skip Bayless said, the shot to win the Game 7. Talented basketball player, but he's recently stirred up some controversy because on Twitter he shared the anti-Semitic documentary Hebrews to Negroes, and this stirred up some controversy because it's this documentary states or it makes anti-Semitic claims such as the Jews were behind the slave trade, and it's also it does the typical Black Hebrew Israelite script where it claims that the white Jews, quote unquote, are like fake Jews, and the African Americans are the true descendants of the biblical and ancient Israelites. Now, obviously this documentary is filled with pseudo-history and pseudo-science, pseudo-archaeology, and it's really not surprising that Kyrie Irving has shared this on Twitter, because if you followed his Twitter before, he shared like Hotep or Afrocentrist picture, excuse me, Afrocentrist or Hotep memes and pictures, and honestly, I know people keep emphasizing that he went to Duke, but he only went to Duke because he got a basketball scholarship. It wasn't because of academics. Anyone that states that he's a smart or that he's intelligent really needs to look at his Twitter and all the previous claims that he's made, such as the flat Earth claims that he made back in 2017. He has made it clear that he's made it clear that he, if believes, if or at the very least entertains the idea of flat Earth. That's obviously like stupid as hell. And that he's a conspiracy theorist with things such as the various claims that Alex Jones has made. He shared things that shared Alex Jones videos and implied that he agrees with Alex Jones on certain things. And so basically in this video, I'm going to break it down and show how both Kyrie Irving and the Black Hebrew Israelites are just straight up wrong and and straight up astronomically incorrect with their claims regarding the ancestries of the modern day Jews and who are the descendants of the ancient Israelites. So this video is going to show how the modern day Jews, whether it's Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, or Sephardic, can trace their ancestry back to Israel and the wider Levant. And this is done through DNA tests, and which show that they share common ancestry that goes back to what is today Israel, Palestine. And also, it should be emphasized there's zero evidence that the Jews controlled the slave trade. And obviously, that was anyone who knows anything about early modern history, the history of the Atlantic world, and the Columbian Exchange, and the history of exploration and colonization of the early, modern era or colonial era of, basically that the slave trade was controlled by the Dutch, English, and Portuguese. It was started by the Portuguese, and the Jews never had the power to control the slave trade or conspiratorially control things from behind the scenes. So, but regardless, this video is going to focus on, the claims that the documentary made and that the Black Hebrew Israelites make about who the quote unquote true descendants are of the Israelites. But first, if in case you guys missed it, here is a clip from Kyrie Irving's one of his post game press interviews where he got into it with a reporter. And I'll share this before I go into the various DNA evidence, archaeological, historical evidence, and break it down and straight up debunk the claims that the documentary that Kyrie shared made. So before I get into that, I want to share the exchange he had with the reporter in a post game press conference. He obviously makes a fool of himself and just looks crazy as hell. And it's entertaining to watch. So before I get into it, you guys can go ahead and take a look.
Right, but my stuff is not
so let's move on.
filled with anti-Semitic
Let's
stuff.
move on. Don't dehumanize me up here.
I'm not putting it out there. People are going to say that you are
promoting. Put it out there just like you put things out there, right?
Yeah, but
move on to the next question.
But Kyrie, you have to understand that by
I don't have to understand anything from you.
It's not me.
Nothing.
By
it's no people that you're making up, bro. Move on.
So now that you guys were able to enjoy that clip where Kyrie is going at it with the reporter in the press conference, I think we should get into a bit of the history of the Jews in the Mediterranean and Europe up until the Middle Ages, because I think, especially with the Black Hebrew Israelites, there's kind of a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding of how the various Jewish groups got or ended up where they were in Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. Like there's this idea specifically with Ashkenazi Jews that, because they're in Europe and they look white, they must be the same, or they must just be converts to Judaism, or European converts to Judaism that have nothing to do genetically with the Israelites, when that's completely false. It just shows a lack of understanding of the history of the Jews in the Mediterranean and how basically like the historiography or the timeline of events that led to the different Jewish groups ending up where they were. Brief recap. So the Assyrians under King Shalmaneser V, they sack Samaria and northern kingdom of Israel and send the northern Israelites, specifically like upper class elites, into exile, while it's based on historical and genetic evidence that a lot of the northern Israelites remained in place. So, but besides that, some of the elite northern Israelites were sent into exile, or they fled to Judah and basically, mix with the Judahites and actually help the Judahites in forming and editing and compiling the Old Testament in the 7th century BCE. But Shalmaneser V and the Assyrians resettled a lot of these elite northern Israelites, and this is what leads to, or this is who the lost tribes of Israel are descended from. Although it seems quite clear that the Samaritans of the modern era and various other Jewish groups such as the Mizrahi Middle Eastern Jews in Syria, Iraq, etc., are descended from these quote-unquote lost tribes, or the Israelites who were resettled. And so, about basically a century after that, the Judahites were exiled by the Babylonians under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar II. After the invasion or destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar then disposes of the Judahite king Jehoiakim, and along with these Judahites, so basically the northern Israelites and the Judahites who were exiled by the Assyrians and Babylonians, they're the closest, based on the genetic evidence, the closest, and also the physical anthropology, the closest modern day ethnic groups that are related to these exiled Judahites and Israelites would be the Mizrahi Jews, as previously mentioned, of Syria, Iraq, Iran, etc. So then, a couple centuries later, during the Roman era, there were also Jewish communities in Alexandria, Antioch, Asia Minor, Rome, Toledo in Spain, and this didn't necessarily result from these exiles by the Assyrians and Babylonians that happened centuries earlier. It's just that, like any other ethnic group, the Jews moved around the Mediterranean because the Roman Empire, there was a network of roads and routes through the Mediterranean Sea that allowed travel and movement of various peoples. And there have been genetic studies on first, second century, excuse me, first or second century Roman bodies that have been found, and it shows that there was a lot of movement from the Middle East into Italian peninsula and basically all over. But so yeah, like anyone else, the Jews would have moved around the Mediterranean and formed various communities. And most notably, I mentioned Alexandria, Antioch, Asia Minor, Rome, Toledo. But Alexandria, there was a noticeable and thriving Jewish community and that's where the Greek Septuagint was written, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament translated into Greek. But not long after that, in the first century, the Jewish-Roman War occurred, and that ended with the destruction of Jerusalem under with the Roman army under the leadership of Emperor Vespasian. After this, after the destruction of Jerusalem, Jews were scattered across the Mediterranean because Jerusalem was being turned into a more Roman city, and the Jews were kicked out. And some migrated further into Northern Europe. That's how we get Ashkenazi Jews. And any European admixture would have occurred during this time, shortly after not only the first Jewish-Roman War, but also the second Jewish revolt that occurred in 130, 135 CE, led by Simon Bar Kokhba. So another thing to keep in mind, once you realize that the Jews migrated and were scattered across the Mediterranean and migrated to Toledo, places like Toledo in Spain. That's how we get Sephardic Jews, or the beginnings of Sephardic Jewishness. And also once you realize that after the admixture between the Jews that migrated more into Northern Europe during the Roman era, after this, the European Jews were pretty isolated communities during the Middle Ages and early modern era. They were treated as outsiders. Rumors spread, such as the rumors about blood libel and European Christian children being kidnapped by Jewish people, and that's how the blood libel rumor. That's what basically the blood libel rumor is about. And even the Black Death of the late Middle Ages was blamed on the Jews, and as a result, various Jewish communities in Europe were the victims of violent attacks as retaliation by the European Christians. So basically, no admixture would have occurred during this time because the European Christians and Jews would not have intermixed due to these Jewish communities being isolated and treated as outsiders, and Jews would have married other Jews, and Christians would not have married European Jews at this time. And as mentioned before, when we look at modern populations, the Mizrahi Jews they're the ones that would be descended from the deported Israelite populations that took place during the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles, and the thing is, they're still around in present-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, as I've mentioned before. So if you want like a modern-day analog or example of what the Israelites would have looked like, they would look like the modern Mizrahi Jews, who are Jews that still live in the Middle East. Also, you have the ethnic group known as the Samaritans, who are closely related and descended from the northern Israelites who were not deported, and the Samaritans have their own version of the Abrahamic religion and their own version of the Torah. But genetic evidence shows that these groups are related to the Israelites. So now that we did a brief recap of the history of the Jews in the Mediterranean and Europe, and provided some modern day analogs of what the Israelites would have looked like, I think we should get into basically the art history or art depictions from the ancient world, and do a comparison with ancient and modern Semitic groups, because, as you know, the Israelites and by extension the modern day Jews, they speak a Semitic language, Hebrew, and there are obviously were and still are other groups that speak Semitic languages, so we can use them as a comparison for what the Israelites would have looked like. Now, the reason why I think we should bring up art depictions and these comparisons with modern Semites is one of the arguments from the Black Hebrew Israelites and this documentary Hebrews to Negroes is that the Israelites would have looked black, or they would have been black by modern standards, and therefore would have that makes the African Americans descendants from the Israelites. Now, obviously, this is pseudo archaeology and pseudo history, revisionist history, and this is literally literally contradicted by the art history and depictions of Semitic groups and Israelites from the ancient world, which shows that they look Middle Eastern or for lack of a better term, Caucasoid in appearance. So we can find depictions of Israelites in Near Eastern art from various reliefs from the Assyrians and Mesopotamians, and it shows that these reliefs and depictions show that the Israelites really don't look any different than the Assyrians and Mesopotamians, which is no surprise because the Assyrians were a Semitic group and they spoke a Semitic language. And if you take a look at various Assyrian depictions of themselves, they look no different than other Middle Eastern groups and like modern Middle Eastern peoples. We also have depictions from ancient Egyptian art that depicts the Levantines or Canaanites, and the reason why I bring this up is, as I brought up in a previous video, the Israelites were basically Canaanite, and they were the descendants of the Bronze Age Canaanites, as shown by the archaeological record. The Israelites have a very similar, if not almost identical material culture to the Bronze Age Canaanites. And the archaeological record shows that the Israelites and other various Levantine groups, such as the Phoenicians, were basically a continuation of Bronze Age Canaan. But regardless, with that in mind, the ancient Egyptian art depictions of Asiatics or Canaanites, Levantines, whatever you want to call them, they were depicted as pale skinned with Mediterranean facial features such as, long, a long, thin nose, and beards that are seen across the Mediterranean and at this time in various art depictions. But most notably, they depicted the Canaanites or Asiatics as pale skinned. Now we also have Akkadian and Assyrian statues and reliefs, and I bring this up because, as the Akkadians, and the Assyrians, they spoke Semitic languages, and they were of Semitic. These were two Semitic ethnic groups, so they would have been very closely related to the Israelites. And so basically, with that in mind, their statues and reliefs depict these Semitic civilizations as Middle Eastern, or again, for lack of a better term, Caucasoid in appearance. Now, if we want to look at modern day Semitic groups, a lot of people don't seem to forget that the Arabs are a modern day Semitic group, because the Arab is a Semitic language, so they would be closely related to the Israelites and by extension modern day Jews. And as we all know, the Arabs they're colloquially referred to as brown, and they look very different than both white and black people. So, and they look similar to other Middle Eastern groups. You also have Jews that live in Yemen, the Yemenite Jews, and they would obviously be descended from the Israelites and closely related to other Semitic groups. They're another good comparison group, and you can take a look at these pictures that show these various modern Semitic groups, such as the Arabs and Yemenite Jews. And you also have modern-day Assyrians who are descended from the ancient Assyrians, and this is demonstrated by their cultural traditions and the DNA evidence. So now I want to get into the DNA evidence and DNA studies that show or demonstrate that the modern-day Jews are the closest populations to ancient Levantines and Canaanites, and specifically Israelites, and also the DNA evidence that shows the ancient Levantines and Canaanites were very much distinct and completely different in terms of genotype from modern-day West Africans and West African populations, which completely debunks the argument that is put forth by the Black Hebrew Israelites. Specifically with the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, they have the wide DNA haplogroup that is common among Middle Easterners, but is not very common among Europeans, which indicates, since it's common among Middle Easterners, that the origin of this haplogroup within Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews lies within the Middle East, and it probably goes back to antiquity. Principal component analyses show that Jews cluster with Middle Eastern groups, both ancient and modern, which also indicates a genetic origin in the Middle East, specifically ancient Israel. And also important to note is when you look at the common ancestry and genetic overlap of the three Jewish groups, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi, the point of divergence was dated by geneticists back to about 2,000, 2,500 years ago, which is right when right around the Babylonian exile, and when there were various, or when the Judahites were exiled and deported to various parts of the Babylonian Empire. So that indicates that the differences among Mizrahi and European Jews is they branched off during during antiquity, not during they did not branch off at an earlier point or during the modern era. So this points to as mentioned before, a common ancestry in Israel. And also another group, the Samaritans, who have been demonstrated to be closely related to the quote-unquote lost tribes of Israel, and have been in Israel since antiquity, along with the fact that the Mizrahi Jews have been in the Middle East since antiquity, or the ancient world. When you do with the DNA analysis of Samaritans compared and when they are compared with various with the three Jewish ethnic groups, these DNA analyses show that the Samaritans also have common ancestry with the Ashkenazi Sephardic Mizrahi Jews, along with the Druze, which are an ethnic group in Lebanon, and the Palestinians. So the fact that all these ethnic groups can trace their lineage back to the Middle East, most likely Israel, points in the direction of the Samaritans and Jews tracing their ancestry back to the Israelites. Now, you can use estimates on modern populations to use a pretty precise method of dating to see when certain populations split off. And when you compare like European Jews, like the Sephardic and Ashkenazi, to modern Middle Eastern groups like Palestinians, Samaritans who are in northern Israel, and Mizrahi Jews who are in places like Iraq, that is clearly enough evidence, and is clearly proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews trace their ancestry back to the Middle East. But there's also ancient DNA available of ancient Canaanite populations, and when we look at the principal component analysis of that compares the ancient DNA with modern groups such as Iraqi, Iranian, and Georgian Jews, we see that the Iraqi, Iranian, and Georgian Jews cluster closest to the ancient Canaanite samples, Neolithic and Bronze Age Levantine samples, and also, interesting enough, ancient and modern Egyptians, who are both ancient and modern Egyptians were and still are quite Middle Eastern in appearance. And they also cluster with the Bedouins, the Druze, as mentioned before. But, this is, in my opinion, a slam dunk in terms of showing that modern Jewish populations, specifically Mizrahi Jews, are clearly the closest group, or genetically speaking, with the ancient Canaanites and Neolithic and Bronze Age Levantine populations, who were the ancestors of the Israelites, because the Israelites were Canaanites, and Canaanites were descended from Neolithic Levantine populations. And the fact that there's clearly a close genetic relationship with between the Iraqi, Iranian, Georgian Jews and the ancient Canaanites and Neolithic era Levantines makes it clear that the ancient Canaanites, Israelites, and Neolithic Levantines would look very much like the modern Iraqi, Iranian, and Georgian Jews. And you can Google image what the Iraqi and Iranian Jews look like. And so, yeah, basically that shows that what the physical appearance of the Canaanites, Israelites, and Neolithic Levantines would look like. And it also shows that the modern day Jews in both the Middle East and Europe, because European Jews like Ashkenazi and Sephardic share a common ancestry with the Middle Eastern Jews. But yeah, this is more evidence that modern Jews, especially Middle Eastern Jews, trace their ancestry back to not only the Canaanites but the Neolithic Levant. And going back to the Ashkenazi Jews, they were part of a genetic bottleneck, which means that there was, in the ancient world, a certain size population of Jews, and then one of these groups, the Ashkenazi, migrated into Europe, and their population decreased, which, and then their population was isolated, and then they created a new population essentially, which that's where the term bottleneck comes from. It means that population gets smaller and more less genetically diverse and less genetically distinct from each other. And also, these DNA studies on the Ashkenazi Jews show that they have haplogroups that are Middle Eastern in origin. Something else to note is that when you look at the Bronze Age Levantine populations, which Canaanites, who are the ancestors of the Israelites, because as I'll keep hammering home, in the previous video and in this video, I've stated repeatedly that the Israelites were Canaanites based on the material culture. So by extension, when you look at the Canaanites and their DNA, you can see an influx of Iranian Neolithic and Caucasus DNA, and the Iranians in Caucasus, those genetic populations are more northerly. So you see an influx of genomes from those areas, and that gives us an even better idea of what their phenotypic expression is in the Canaanites and what types of genes they had. And also something, a DNA study that's similar in, or I should rephrase it, a DNA study that is related to the point I just made, a specific point I just made about the influx of more northerly Iranian Caucasus DNA, is that there was a DNA study from 2018 by Harney et al. That showed that, or it shows that blue-eyed, fair-skinned settlers entered into Israel, the Israel-Palestine area, 6,500 years ago during the Chalcolithic era. And that is literally the opposite of the argument that is put forth by the Black Hebrew Israelites regarding the physical appearance of the of the ancient Israelites. So, yeah, this DNA study shows that blue-eyed, fair-skinned settlers entered into Israel during the Chalcolithic era. So that pretty much just blows away or destroys the Afrocentrist Black Hebrew Israelite argument right there. And another set of DNA studies, specifically with modern Lebanese people, because modern, spoiler alert, modern Lebanese people are mostly descended from ancient Canaanites, and they are quite similar, not almost identical in appearance to Jews and various Semitic populations. So modern Lebanese peoples have been shown to be genetically closest to the ancient Canaanites and Phoenicians. These DNA studies show that they share 93%, or 93% of their genome goes back to ancient Canaan and before. And principal component analysis shows that the modern Lebanese people, or the modern Lebanese populations, cluster with the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and Hellenistic Canaanites, or Hellenistic Levantines, I should say, because by the Hellenistic era, I think it's, not necessarily accurate to call them Canaanites. They call them Hellenistic Phoenicians or Levantines. But, and I bring up, the other reason I bring up these studies with the modern Lebanese in their comparison with the Phoenicians and Canaanites is because, as mentioned before, Israelites were Canaanites, and they would be genetically almost identical and very related to the Phoenicians and Canaanites. So if you want an idea of what the ancient Israelites looked like, you just gotta look. If you want an idea of what the ancient Israelites looked like, you just gotta look at the modern Lebanese, specifically maybe Lebanese Jews and Christians, because they, all the Lebanese population whether Jews, Christians, or Muslims, they cluster closest to Bronze Age, Iron Age, and Hellenistic Levantine populations. And so I will I will put the citations in the description, specifically with the various ancient DNA and Jewish haplogroup and even the Lebanese studies. And so that way, you guys can go ahead and read these DNA studies for yourselves. They're actually very interesting. And these studies shed a lot of light on the genomes and the genetics of the ancient and modern Semitic populations. But yeah, I will be putting the citations in the description. Now, to complement the genetic evidence of the ancient Canaanites, I think it's important and it would be a good idea to look at the physical anthropology of the ancient Israelite remains that we have, and the studies that have been done by physical anthropologists and archaeologists on these ancient Israelite remains, and compare them to and see what groups they are closest to in terms of their the craniofacial features. But according to the biblical and ancient Near Eastern scholar B.S.J. Isserlin, the Israelites' physical remains and specifically skulls show that they were broadly speaking a Mediterranean type, so similar to, broadly speaking, other Levantine, ancient Levantine populations, and also by extension modern Levantines, and also Southern Greeks, the ancient Maltese, Sicilian, Phoenicians in Sicily, Greek colonies in Sicily. So yeah, basically they were a broadly speaking, part of the Mediterranean type. And as a point of comparison, the the Phoenician skulls, because both the Phoenicians and Israelites, and I'm going to keep hammering this home, were Canaanites, and so therefore they share a common ancestry and were very similar genetically. But the Phoenician skulls show a Mediterranean Caucasoid type, and also physical anthropologists have done reconstructions of an Israelite man, and basically he shows, as stated before, that he was a more of a Mediterranean type. Now, I think it's also important to bring up the Neolithic Jericho skull, because Jericho, which is in northern Israel, would be an ideal spot to find ancient remains from whether it be the Iron Age, Bronze Age, or Neolithic. So when we look at the Jericho skull from the Neolithic era, the Neolithic date predates the Israelites by a couple thousands of years. The Neolithic Jericho skull shows a Eastern Mediterranean, basically non-African type. For example, a narrow nasal cavity. And when archaeologists and anthropologists look at the skulls of Jews from around Jesus' time, and I bring up Jesus' time because there's also a lot of debate about what Jesus looked like debate is between, scholars and enthusiasts of the ancient world and the Afrocentrists. But skulls of Jews from first century have been shown to be most similar to modern day Iraqi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, and basically in total the ancient Israelite, ancient Jewish, Canaanite skulls, Phoenician skulls, they're consistent with the physical appearance of modern day Mizrahi Jews, Samaritans, Lebanese, and Syrians. So, you just have to look to these modern Semitic populations for an idea of what the ancient Israelites would have looked like. Now, lastly, I think we should look at two biblical quotes. Now, normally, as you guys would have heard in my previous video, I think the vast majority of the Old Testament is myth, and it should not be taken as history or an accurate account of events. But there are probably some kernels, especially in the Book of Kings, historical events and kernels of what life was like in ancient Israel. So perhaps we can look to two biblical quotes for an idea of what the ancient Israelites looked like. So the Song of Songs describes basically the Israelites, or an Israelite type with tan skin and dark hair, so a Mediterranean type, as mentioned when discussing the physical anthropology. And also in Samuel chapter 17, verse 42, says, "And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of fair countenance." So basically, this is saying that David, who by the way was described with having red hair in the book of Samuel, he was, fair skinned, but or fair in appearance, but basically with like a tan or a reddish tan, or like maybe he got like a mix of sunburn and tan, but something like that. And also a third biblical quote that we can look at is Lamentations 4, verse 7. "Her Nazarites were purer than snow, they were whiter than milk, they were more ruddy in body than rubies, their polishing was of sapphire." So basically it's saying they were quite fair-skinned with a reddish color on their body. So, in conclusion, the Kyrie was basically spreading misinformation and anti-Semitism by posting that video on his Twitter, and that, to be quite frank, that documentary is full of shit, because the based on the evidence I provided in this video, and I just need to briefly say that the Holocaust absolutely, without question, happened, and 6 million Jews were exterminated by the Nazis, and this isn't even something that should be a topic of debate or questioned by people like Kyrie Irving. Denying the Holocaust is, extremely stupid, and it spreads misinformation. Not to mention it's anti-Semitic. But yeah, in conclusion, I'm sorry if this pisses off Afrocentrists or the Black Hebrew Israelites, but African Americans are not even remotely African Americans are not even remotely related to the Israelites. As has been shown by genetics and history, African Americans or Black Americans are descended from West African groups, from specifically Angola and Nigeria, and when you guys look at the two or the principal component analysis from the 2017 DNA study of the ancient Egyptians, you see the Bronze Age and Neolithic Bronze Age Canaanites and the Neolithic Levantines. They cluster with a bunch of modern Middle Eastern groups, including Middle Eastern Jews, modern Middle Eastern Jews, and they cluster closely with the Mediterranean, Southern European, ancient Egyptian, and all various Middle Eastern groups, but there were, when you look at the two sub-Saharan or West African groups that were included in the analysis, they are way, they're like the complete opposite side of the chart for in the principal component analysis. They're not even close to any of the ancient or modern Levantine populations. So, I mean, yeah, the evidence shows, in conclusion, the modern day descendants of the Israelites are, the Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews. And if you want an idea of what the ancient Israelites looked like, you just got to look at the Mizrahi Jews or the Ashkenazi or Sephardic Jews. So that is what the evidence shows.